and an answer. A man suddenly falls seriously and violently ill during an internal flight from Siberia to Moscow in August 2020. The plane diverts for an emergency landing. An ambulance meets it on the runway. In hospital, he's placed in a coma and put on a ventilator. This isn't a normal medical emergency. The sick passenger is President Putin's most prominent critic, Alexei Navalny. He's been poisoned with Novichok, a chemical nerve agent first developed by the Soviet Union in the 1970s, and his supporters suspect the president is behind the attack. 2 days later, the opposition leader is flown, unconscious, from Russia for intensive care in Germany. He defies the odds and survives the assassination attempt. You might think that he wouldn't be keen on returning to the state that all the evidence suggests tried to kill him, but you'd be wrong. He returned to Russia in January of this year, but moments after he landed, he's arrested and imprisoned. He'll now likely spend years in a prison cell. So this week we're asking, why did Alexei Navalny return to Russia?
Part 1. Back from the dead.
He is very much a guy next door, an ordinary person with extraordinary life. I'm Arkady Ostrovsky. I'm the Russia and Eastern Europe editor, The Economist, and I'm the author of a book called The Invention of Russia from Gorbachev's Freedom to Putin's War.
Arkady first met Alexei Navalny 12 years ago. He's interviewed him many times.
He's a politician through and through. I mean, he's a professional politician, driven, I think, by his clear desire for power, because he wants to change the world. In terms of personality, he is very unassuming in many ways. There is no grandeur about him.
An early introduction to inequality came during his Soviet-era childhood in the late 1970s. Home was Omniansk, a town not far from Moscow.
Now, that town in the Soviet period was one of the closed cities. Foreigners were not allowed to visit. It was a nuclear town where nuclear physicists lived, which is why it was closed. And the physicists were a quite privileged group within that Soviet system. And it also was a garrison town. And his father was in the military. I think his experience, as he told me, of the Soviet Union was mainly about sort of queues, long lines in the shops. And then he saw the Soviet Union disintegrate, and he saw the impoverishment, he saw the gangs and criminals overrunning his town. He had a pretty rough childhood in the sense that there was a lot of street fighting.
Alexei Navalny was 15 when the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991. Beyond the financial inequality and disorder in his town, he became aware of another consequence of this drastic shift from communism to capitalism, the rise of the oligarchs, a small group of extremely rich individuals with political power. In the 1990s, President Boris Yeltsin transferred massive amounts of wealth to them through his rapid privatization of the majority of Russia's state-owned companies, which they took over. In return, they financed his re-election.
I think his anti-corruption drive was inspired partly because of what he saw in the 1990s in Russia, where there was a promise after the collapse of the Soviet Union of equality, of transformation of Russia from an empire into nation state. And what he saw instead was oligarchy, kleptocracy, insider deals.
Arkady says the rampant corruption which shaped post-communist Russia reinforced a determination to expose it.
He was not part of the Moscow elite. He studied law at a very much sort of second-tier university. And when he started his journey into politics, he would have been very much looked down at because he was not part of the sort of the special Moscow circle. He started ideologically very much on the left in a way, but also with strong ties to the Russian nationalists.
Alexei Navalny has been criticised for some of his early writings and videos, including one from 15 years ago in which he compared people from Russia's mostly Muslim North Caucasus region to cockroaches. But he also started to name and shame those he suspected of involvement in shady practices, using unconventional means to do it.
He started buying shares in Russian state-controlled companies, and that made him a shareholder with 0.00001%. But those shares would qualify him to go to the state companies' AGMs, annual general meetings, and ask very uncomfortable questions about how they spend their money, and it was part of his anti-corruption campaign.
Alexei Navalny published his investigations on a popular blog. In 2011, he founded the Anti-Corruption Foundation to expose top officials. Later that year, he emerged as a leading voice at election fraud demonstrations. He rallied with tens of thousands of protesters in Moscow to accuse President Putin's party of stealing the parliamentary election after it suffered unexpected losses at the polls, caused in part by an effective tactical voting campaign promoted by Alexei Navalny.
The protest effectively was sparked by his politics when he called on the Russian people to vote against any party but the Kremlin's United Russia Party. And that suddenly produced quite a result, because it was the first time the Kremlin was not prepared for it. And then the Kremlin decided to rig the elections. It was the rigging of the elections that's brought people out in the streets. And I think it was at that point the Kremlin recognized that he is actually something certainly to watch. He was a nuisance. They put him in jail. They opened charges against him.
And when did he become a danger to the Kremlin and Putin?
Well, judging by the Kremlin's actions, he became the danger last summer when they decided to poison him with Novichok nerve agent.
The Kremlin vigorously denies any involvement in the poisoning of Alexei Navalny. During his annual press conference, President Putin said that if Russian agents had been responsible, they would probably have finished the job. Then he laughed. So did you think the assassination attempt galvanised him further?
I think it has. He spent several weeks in a coma. When I spoke to him before he went back to Moscow, I think it was October, I went to interview him in Berlin. One thing which kind of struck me is that several times throughout that conversation, throughout that interview, he said, well, when I died, or after I died, I think as far as he was concerned, he's been dead and he's come back from the dead. I think that's what makes this whole journey, this whole story so extraordinarily powerful, is that there is a sort of a mythical element to it, that this is somebody like in a fairy tale who they tried to kill him, he's come back from the dead.
Part 2. A calculated risk.
There was absolutely no other option. You can't be a Russian politician from abroad. Can you be a British politician and live in Spain? That wouldn't really work, right? So you can't really fight for whatever you're proposing to your country and not actually be there with the people who you are asking for support.
In her role as head of investigations for Alexei Navalny's Anti-Corruption Foundation, Maria Pevchik oversaw the production of a video called Putin's Palace.
Привет, это Навальный. И это расследование мы придумали еще, когда я находился в реанимации.
Introduced by Alexei Navalny, the 2-hour investigation profiles a huge mansion on the Black Sea coast, which it claims belongs to the Russian president. Extravagant features include a church, casino, ice hockey rink, and even its own border checkpoint. The report alleges the billion-dollar property, which President Putin denies is his, was paid for by entrenched corruption. The video was published to coincide with Alexei Navalny's return to Russia. Knowing the world's eyes would be on him, the video was a viral hit, clocking up over 100 million global views. But now he's in prison. So was Mr. Navalny's return to Russia really worth it?
We were not stupid. We realized all of the risks. I mean, we knew exactly what was going to happen. And it was definitely a matter of principle to come back, especially after Putin tried to kill him with a chemical nerve agent.
During the televised press conference where he denied any link to the poisoning, President Putin did confirm that security service agents had been following Alexei Navalny. Over the years, the opposition leader and his supporters have faced raids, prison time, attacks and house arrests. Maria says the recent state reaction, which also saw over 1,000 protesters arrested, is by far the most intense.
They have started like a final sort of crackdown on our NGO and on my colleagues. And Alexei's press secretary, Kira, is under house arrest. Lyubov Sobol, our key politician, she has been detained as well, the chief of our medical alliance that fight for the rights of medical workers, which is extremely relevant now during the times of COVID. She was arrested as well. So many people at the same time. It's pretty clear that Putin has taken a decision to just shut us up.
Alexei Navalny has been hit financially too. He was recently fined 850,000 rubles, that's just under $11,500, for slandering people who appeared in a pro-Kremlin video by referring to them as corrupt stooges and traitors. Are you mentioned at all on state radio or TV? How is your foundation portrayed? What do they say about you?
You mean the Russian propaganda? So essentially they just make things up. They run these evening shows, political shows, where they would spend hours just trashing us, trashing Alexei Navalny, trashing my colleagues, trashing myself. I'm one of the biggest targets of their propaganda. They are accusing me being a foreign spy and actually poisoning Alexei. And then, of course, they proceed to trashing of our investigations. I would say that our video is fake, our investigation is fake, and this building is in fact a hotel, trying to discredit our investigation. So that's kind of number one thing to do. Then thing number two is just trash and destroy Alexei Navalny by saying that he is the worst thing that can happen to humanity. I'm one of the very big political shows in the evening. The presenter, he compared Alexei to Hitler and actually said that Hitler is better.
The European Court of Human Rights ruled that Alexei Navalny should be released because his life is at risk in detention, a decision the Kremlin condemned as unlawful, saying sufficient safeguards are in place to protect him. The leader might be away from public view for the foreseeable future, but Maria says don't be fooled into thinking Russia's opposition movement will lose its momentum.
It definitely hasn't been weakened because it grew so much at the point of his arrest and at the point of Putin's palace video. And we found a way to just do exactly what we were doing when he's around, but just do it without him. And that's exactly our plan right now. And I think that we have sent the signal that it's not about just one person, one very talented, very charismatic person, but it's not just about him. To be honest, people have more and more reasons to be upset every day. Literally, every day, it is getting worse.
Part 3. Is Russia ready for change?
I think that when it comes to attitudes to Vladimir Putin, the Russian people divide up roughly into 5 groups.
Steve Rosenberg is the BBC's Moscow correspondent.
The extremes, you've got the Putin lovers and the Putin haters, the Putinophiles for whom the president can do no wrong, and the Putin phobes, those people who are willing to take to the streets to condemn him. But these groups are pretty small, I think, and sandwiched in the middle, you've got the mass, the majority, some of whom vote for Putin because they see no alternative, and there are many Russians who don't care really who's running the country, as long as they're getting paid and their pensions are paid on time. And then there are Russians who don't like the direction their country is moving in, but don't really believe they have the power to change anything, let alone the president. And it's this mass in the middle that the Kremlin relies on really to keep control.
Some countries tackle apathy by encouraging faith in a strong democratic system. Steve says that's not a credible remedy in Russia.
Democracy itself, that word, has almost become a dirty word, actually. It's become soiled or tarnished in Russia in the economic chaos of the 1990s, just after the Soviet Union collapse. Because for many Russians, democracy sort of became associated with poverty, with inequality, or chaos, confrontation, war. Vladimir Putin has exploited that to consolidate his power. What he has done, he put in place this system of Russian democracy. So it says democracy on the tin, but if you open up the tin, it looks and smells more like autocracy. But you know, when I meet Russians, I find it's not so much democracy that's their priority. It's social justice. You know, they look around and they see a big gap between rich and poor. They see bureaucrats, they see policemen, they see judges who are on the make. And this need, this desire, this demand for social justice, I think is rising in Russia.
And this growing disillusion among many Russians has fueled new protests in recent years, notably last summer in Russia's Far East, where people took to the streets after the arrest of a popular regional governor. Sergei Fergal was forced into a van by officers sent from Moscow, who took him back to the capital. He's accused of involvement in the murders of several businessmen, some dating back 15 years. His supporters say it's a witch hunt.
He's not from President Putin's party. He'd actually defeated the Kremlin candidate to win the governorship. And the suspicion is that the Russian authorities were waiting for a moment to move in and to remove him. But this sparked huge anger. We saw months of demonstrations, tens of thousands of people coming out onto the street. And to begin with, the protesters' main demand was, Moscow, send back our governor, we'll put him on trial here. But gradually, week by week, what we noticed was the slogans were becoming increasingly anti-Putin. And so I think there is a fear in the Kremlin. Well, you know, if this can happen in Khabarovsk, a long way away from Moscow, this could happen closer to Moscow. That is Vladimir Putin's biggest fear.
And it's also Alexei Navalny's biggest opportunity. His broad anti-corruption movement has empowered Russians to protest in public, many for the first time. He attracts international media coverage, but are enough Russian people ready to respond?
If you look at the polling, right, then Mr. Navalny has very minimal popularity across the country. But that's misleading because he doesn't have access to Russian television, the biggest instrument for shaping public opinion. I think the Kremlin sees Alexei Navalny as the man who could actually wake people up. Because, as I say, many Russians see how well the elite is living. They see the big houses, the big palaces that people in the party of power have built for themselves. And they think that's wrong. And so when someone like Alexei Navalny and his colleagues publish anti-corruption investigations, I think that does strike a chord.
Part 4. Putin under pressure.
Russia's economy hasn't been doing very well really for the last 10 years. So businessmen that I speak to for years now, they've been sort of questioning Putin's lack of economic vision really for kind of driving the country forward.
Catherine Belton is a special correspondent for Reuters. She also wrote the book Putin's People. Previously, the president had a range of achievements to keep the Russian public on his side. Not anymore, says Catherine.
He was so popular in the first 2 terms of his presidency because oil prices were surging, which meant that people's living standards really kind of began to boom. The economy was doing well. You got all these sort of nice little restaurants opening up. That's not happening anymore. And people in Russia are really kind of facing a big hit to their pockets at the moment. Already we've seen incomes decline 10% in the last 8 years. Putin isn't producing anymore.
And how is that helping Navalny?
I think it's really, really helping him. I think they stand more chance in making inroads at some point just because the economy is failing and people are more and more discontented with their lives, not just the ordinary people, but also people within the Moscow elite, because people's living standards have fallen so sharply, and of course Putin's hasn't at all. Putin has always had a pact with the population in which, you know, he could do whatever he wanted to do as long as incomes were rising and people could afford to go on holidays abroad. That pact is also now beginning to kind of fray.
Catherine says the majority of Russians still back Putin, but that support is shrinking fast, especially for his political party, United Russia.
We've seen levels of trust in Putin at 20-year lows. His own personal popularity has fallen. It used to be around 80%. Now it's languishing in the low 60s. But the popularity ratings of United Russia itself are only at 30%. And this is very important at the critical moment, really, because there are going to be parliamentary elections in September, and the ruling party is really going to struggle to gain its traditional majority.
Those critical elections to the lower house of the Russian Federal Assembly are due on or before the 19th of September. So just how detrimental could losses be for President Putin?
Putin's power rests on several things. It rests on his control over the court system, and it rests on his control over both chambers of parliament, which throughout his rule have really acted as rubber stamps for anything that he wants to do. So if he can't maintain his control over the lower chamber of parliament in the elections this September, then really one of the main pillars of his power is going to crumble.
In his first interview since emerging from his coma, Alexei Navalny flagged the upcoming elections as his organisation's priority and is once again encouraging tactical voting to undermine President Putin's party.
So Navalny's political movement isn't allowed to register even as a party to run in the parliamentary elections because the Kremlin, of course, is going to find excuses not to register it. But what Navalny's political movement can do is suggest to voters candidates that they could vote for who are not part of the Kremlin ruling party, so as to kind of whittle away and eventually destroy United Russia's majority. And I think that's what the Kremlin very much feared.
So why did Alexei Navalny return to Russia? The simple answer is he wanted to carry on fighting against what he sees as a corrupt regime. But a strategy based around defeating President Putin and his party in an election has, of course, one big flaw. We're not talking about a normal democracy. This is Russian democracy, where things tend to go the way President Putin wants them to. If the elections are proven unfair, Alexei Navalny still has one chance. He hopes the people will rise up. But if they don't, it's hard to see how he will ever accomplish his goal, and his return may look more reckless than brave. This edition of The Inquiry was presented by me, Charmaine Cozier, and produced in London by Richard Fenton-Smith.